Okay, it looks like it's loading through. And we're live.
Great. Welcome, everyone. We're so sorry for the delay. We had some technical trouble. I am Mayan Dauber. I am the Executive Director of the Eastern Region at American Friends of the Israel Philharmonic, and I'm so glad to welcome you all today to Schmoozic, which is a program we began during the pandemic where we talk candidly to authors and musicians and artists of all kinds. And I just want to plug another Schmoozic we're doing later this month with Daniel Liebskind, the architect who is working on a memorial for the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. So stay tuned for information on that. We've been so successful in our programming because of you, our audience. So thanks for joining us and supporting us. And I hope you'll continue to do it. I'm especially pleased to welcome my dear friend and, full disclosure, my former high school classmate, Menachem Kaiser, to Schmoozic today to talk about his wonderful book, Plunder, his debut book, Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure. Menachem was born and raised in Toronto. He did his BA at Columbia University. He won a Fulbright to Lithuania, where he studied the Vilnius ghetto. And he did an MFA at the University of Michigan. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the Atlantic and so many more publications. So Menachem, thanks for being here.
It's so fun.
Good, I'm glad. So what I thought I'd do is I'd give an overview of your book for people who haven't read it, and you certainly don't need to have read it for this conversation. And then I'll ask you the 1,000,001 questions I have for you. And then we'll open it up to people at the end. So if you have a question, please just type it into the chat and hopefully we'll get to it at the end. So this book, one of the remarkable things about this book, I think, is that there are so many stories contained within it. And I think each one of those stories could probably be a book in its own right. But basically, it's a story about Menachem reclaiming property that belonged to his grandfather and his great-grandfather, and that was lost during the war in Poland. And this is a grandfather whom Menachem did not know, and about whom he knows very little, though with whom he shares a name, Mayor Menachem Kaiser. On his quest, he hires a lawyer, the killer, which is one of many very humorous moments in the book. She is a Polish woman in her 80s who wears a pink jumpsuit and sort of leads Menachem through this Kafkaesque web of Polish legal bureaucracy, where Menachem has to prove that his great-grandparents, who are certainly dead because A, they died in the Holocaust, and B, would be 140 years old right now, are in fact dead. And that turns out to be a much more complicated thing to do than you might expect. On the way, he also meets some Nazi treasure hunters who are busy digging in the Silesian mountains for Nazi treasure. And they've come to mythologize a man who wrote a guidebook for the area while he was interned in the concentration camps there. And the man improbably is named Abraham Kaiser, although it turns out it's not improbable at all because it is in fact a relative of Menachem's, his grandfather's first cousin. And while he had thought that the whole family had been wiped out, he discovers this new line on the family tree. And Abraham has his own very touching story, a sort of love affair with the German woman who saved him during the war, a really heartbreaking story, actually. And then the book ends in a sort of novelistic way, I would say, with Menachem helping a middle-aged, Midwestern man from the US on his own treasure hunt to find golden eggs that he claims his father-in-law hid in a house, in an attic in Poland. So the story kind of repeats itself. So that's the gist of the book. But Menachem, my first question for you is, how did this book come about? Because you were in Poland for a long time, but at what point did you say, you know, this is really interesting, I have a book here? What was that like?
It's a very interesting question. Initially, so I first went to Poland in 2011. I visited my grandfather's building really as I really saw it as a one-off, like a pilgrimage, like a sort of an obligation. I went, took pictures, and really didn't think I'd go back, really didn't see a reason to go back. I had quote unquote, fulfilled my memory obligation. But then over the next few years, my father sort of kept mentioning, he's like, we have these documents, we own the building, all these people there now, take a look, blah, blah, blah. He kept nudging me. And finally, 2015, he just sort of faxed me all those papers. And at that point, like you mentioned, I hadn't known my grandfather. And when I was reading those documents, it felt like I met him for the first time. It was a real sort of sentimental connection. And I was like, I said, you know what? I feel like I could maybe do this, try and reclaim the building, or at least sort of enter the process. At that point, even though I thought the story was sort of interesting and rich and meaningful, I thought it was only rich, interesting, and meaningful on a personal level. I was pretty adamant that not to write about it at that point. I didn't see a way in. I didn't like, I thought my story was like personally interesting and like a mission, but I didn't see it as having, I didn't see it as new in any way. I think it was a story that's been told many times. And also, I didn't see a way of doing it honestly. I saw like to try and write that story without having known my grandfather felt like I would sort of default into sort of very familiar sentimental narratives. And really felt like it would pull the story in a way that is not exactly dishonest, but it wouldn't be like the most honest. But about a year later, when I sort of met the treasure hunters and fell down that rabbit hole, they were able to sort of first of all, the nature of the story changed quite a bit because now it was quite new and strange. It just became like overwhelmingly bizarre. And that at that point I felt, I'm supposed to be a writer. This feels like a book I have to at least try and write. But it also helped reframe what I was doing vis-a-vis my grandfather. It helped me sort of reapproach that mission and actually sort of confront my own ignorance. And it helped me sort of like, it gave me sort of permission to write into that ignorance, as opposed to sort of pretending it wasn't there and sort of saying, okay, I don't have this sentimental connection. Therefore, like, what is the nature of my mission? It helped me, to interrogate my own motivations. And that felt much more honest and much more freeing. And so it was really at that point, so that was about 2016, that I was like, I have to at least try and write this thing, which really means try and sell this thing.
Interesting. I mean, I think that's actually one of the really winning things about your book, though, is how self-conscious or how conscious you are of the kind of the form you're writing and what you don't know and what you do know and what you're after.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear the sort of genesis of that. But I guess I wonder, once you decided to write the book, did that change your decision making? I mean, for me, if I'm not writing a book and treasure hunters say, come on this drunken overnight camping trip with me, I say, I'm not writing a book, so no thanks. But if I am writing a book, maybe I say, yeah, a drunken overnight camping trip with Nazi treasure hunters, I'm there.
So you and I are different.
I was gonna say
I will say yes to I'll say yes to treasure hunters in most circumstances, but in a different example, it does give you sort of like the nice trick about writing a book is that it gives you superhuman patience. Because you're like, when things happen that are frustrating, they're frustrating, but it's also good material. And so like, so especially the stuff with the court system, going through the court system, which would have been sort of like rip your hair out annoying. Also, and this is sort of like a secret that writers are not supposed to say, but you're also like, okay, but I understand while it's happening that it's also material. And so you are going to approach it differently and sort of take it in differently. And I will say also to go back to your first question, this is one of the reasons why I was actually uninterested in writing a book, because I knew it would be mediated through that. I knew as soon as I sort of decided I would write it, I'm not only experiencing it, I'm trying to record it. I'm even before you actually put pen to paper, you're immediately organizing it and searching for narratives. And that could be like a very honest search, but it also is a sort of organizing and it does warp the experience. It is like a form of mediation. And so I was like, oh, and I've done that before on like much smaller scales. And I was like, can I avoid that here? And so you can't. Well, I couldn't, or I chose not to.
It's like a layer of artifice. As soon as you decide, I'm gonna write this.
As soon as you're taking everything in, you're there, but a part of you's not there. A part of your mind is like, okay, what does this mean in the context of the book? Who is this person? You're searching for funny details. You're recording funny details. You are like half a step removed also, because you're not only the person, in the event, in the occurrence that is like happening right in front of you, but you're also the narrator the future recounting of it. And so like that's happening on like a semi-conscious level, but it's definitely happening. And so the nice thing, it does give you, yeah, it does give you a, like fortitude. Like, look, and for me, I was in this really fortunate position that the book got sold way before I wrote it. Like I had sold a book in 2017, which I was very much in the middle of it. So it did give me a lot of like patience to say yes to everything. And because I was like, I look, I don't know how I'm going to piece it all together, but you know, I have the opportunity to do it. And so, yeah, it is an interesting and tricky question, and really gets at like a lot of the heart of my personal, how I feel conflicted about everything. If I had not sold the book, and like in 2017, so let's say we submitted it to publishers and everyone passed, would I have continued this journey? And it's something that, you know, in the initial draft of the book, I had addressed more directly. We ended up taking that part out, I understand why we took it out. I think it would like alienate a lot of readers, but for me, that was like a really rich and complicated question. It also really gets at the heart of, you know, like the prize. And so like, was I exploiting not only the building, but exploiting the opportunity in order to like advance my career? Hard, those are hard questions, but I like kind of rich, but also kind of secret ones, which is interesting. And I'm not the only person to do this. I think everyone who writes a book, they understand that they're writing a book, especially if you like, you're lucky enough to get some attention and a book deal. Yeah. So how does that function? I don't know.
It's really interesting. I do think your meditations on all of this kind of cuts through some of that. You know, getting inside your head as you allow us to do so often in the book, I think, and your struggles and your, you know, your feelings of the purity of your mission and the lack of purity of your mission. I think all of that helps cut through some of what might otherwise feel like artifice or fake or something like that.
I don't, yeah, I wouldn't say even artifice or fake, but it's a layer.
A
And so
layer, a layer.
it's a layer. And so it gets, usually there's a contract and we pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I think that's for the best, but it's there, because otherwise nonfiction books would be insufferable. They'd all just be like these meditations on nonfiction, and you're like, oh.
True. You know, so you talk a lot about the Nazi treasure hunters and their sort of morally dubious project. I mean, maybe now is actually, I know you have some photos of these tunnels that you went through. Maybe now is a good time to show everyone, you know,
Sure.
what you discovered.
So let me also give like a quick overview of the tunnels themselves, because
Yeah.
it could be a little confusing for people. So basically, these tunnels is a little bit of a misnomer, but they're like these underground complexes built by the Nazis using mostly Jewish slave labor towards the end of the war. And there's a series of 7 tunnels or 7 complexes that encircle Owl Mountain, which is a mountain in Silesia, which is in the southwest of Poland. And these are, none of the tunnels are finished. And so the ones that are more unfinished, a weird way of saying it, those are sort of just like tunnels. They're like holes in the ground, but the ones that are closer to completion are enormous, like on a staggering scale. So we're talking square kilometers of footage, 20-meter high ceilings, rooms that are like 200 feet, 200 meters across. There's real cavernous neighborhoods. And so let me show pictures. And so this is one of the smaller ones called Complex Sobon. So this one is not open to the public. In order to get to it, you sort of have to just know where the GPS coordinates are, or more likely have a guide. So, you know, this was the first time I was actually in there, when these 2 treasure hunters brought me, and we sort of, snuck inside of a hole the size of a manhole to get there. And you could see this is just a hole in the side of a mountain. And this one, okay, this is a larger one. This is a Complex Osufka. This is far, far, far larger. This is one of the bigger ones. It is open to the public. It's managed as something like a national park, so that, you know, you go and there are these like guides with neat haircuts who have like a ready spiel, and they take you around and they give you context. And here you could sort of see the how they did the engineering. So they would build these two parallel tunnels, one on top of the other, and then collapse the ceiling / floor between them in order to create a much larger space. To give you a sense of scale here, this room is something like 25 meters high. So it's really, really enormous structures. From where the photographer is standing to the end of the back wall is something like 150 meters. So these are really, really large. Let me get out, stop video, and I'm back.
It's kind of amazing. I mean, I didn't know anything about these, and it sounds like from the book you didn't know anything about these either. Is that right?
I had no idea. Yeah.
So how, I mean, and these are so vast. I mean, the size of those is just kind of unbelievable. But so how well known are these tunnels to people, let's say in Poland, people in the Jewish world, people not in the Jewish world, survivors? Like, what are the, maybe there are,
Yeah. So
layers.
it's a good, interesting question. Let's talk pre 2015 for a second. I think they were it like if I wouldn't say every Holocaust historian would know about them, but like, they're in the, if you look at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum sort of encyclopedia of sites, they're in there, but there's nothing there. They're just there, they built these tunnels, move on. Now, among the treasure hunter community, they are a like very mythologized place. I would call it like they occupy the core of the mythology of the entire subculture, because mostly because there is no primary documentation for these tunnels. And so they're truly enigmatic. So there's basically no primary documentation as to what the Nazis were planning to do with them. And so they've really occupied a really central place in sort of, let's call it the imagination of that community. And the community is not small. The community is 100,000 plus people who are sort of very invested to varying degrees in this space and in these sorts of questions. That changed. So I would say it was like a little niche. Anyone in the region knows about them. They're tourist attractions, the bigger ones that are open to the public. Didn't attract a lot of real scholarship, I would say. I don't know of any like real Holocaust scholars who sort of spent time on them. They are part of the Gross Rosen subcamp, which is one of the largest networks of concentration camps. So you did certainly have scholarship, but it sort of just got subsumed in that category. Now that changed in 2015 when two of these so-called treasure hunters announced to the world that they had found the Golden Train. And the Golden Train is, according to legend, a train full of looted Nazi gold that left Wrocław, which was then Breslau, which was Germany, was headed towards Berlin with something like 44 crates of gold, got diverted for mysterious reasons, and hidden inside of a mountain, sort of adjacent to these tunnels, or maybe accessible via them. And then this was a longstanding legend in the region. People have been searching or talking about the tunnel for decades. And then 2015, two of these guys claimed to have discovered it. And for really sort of very interesting reasons, the world took them very, very seriously. And so you have like the New York Times, the New Yorker, BBC, Sky, Fox News, the Discovery Channel, the History Channel. They all descended onto this town called Wałbrzych, which is, that's when I first heard about it. I've heard, wow, and I saw, and all this media descended, and they had an interesting problem, because if for visuals, it's hard to take pictures of a train that might not exist. So they just ended up using footage of the tunnels, because as you guys could see, it's pretty spectacular. And so you would have like these incredible photographs of like these underwater rivers, and like these like giant vast complexes, and with these very sort of compelling characters, the treasure hunters, who, look a certain sort of like beefy, Polish men wearing camo. And so that's when I first heard of it. Well, here's actually like a little secret aside. I sort of heard it before when I was teaching in graduate school, and one of the undergrad kids, he approached me and he's like, "Can I write?" I just ignored the rules, and I would let them write about whatever they wanted, but they had to come up with the topic, which was very hard. And one of them came up, he's like, "Look, I want to write this topic, but I don't know if it's a good idea." I was like, "What is it?" He said, "I want to write on my paper about, I'm going to figure out where Hitler's gold is." And I was like, I think, look, that is a hard argument to make. I feel like if you get an A, that means I'm persuaded where the gold is. And so he was adamant and he did it anyways. And the paper was fine. It was pretty middling, but he did mention these tunnels. So I actually asked to thank Colton for bringing to my attention.
Oh my gosh, just in the
These tunnels.
acknowledgements, my God.
I know. He was a good kid.
Wow. So what is, I guess, what is your verdict on these treasure hunters? I remember there's a scene when you first get into one of their Land Rovers, and you do a really good job of painting that picture. I can sort of see it. But you get into one of their Land Rovers, and I think you see a swastika. Maybe it was on a piece of memorabilia. I'm not sure what it was on. And you say something like, "I hope it doesn't mean for him what that means for me." And um, and I'm wondering, I mean, what do you ultimately think of these guys? Are they good, bad, in between? Are they not like a uniform group, so it's impossible to say?
Right. They're, I would say they're definitely not a uniform group. Let me start there. So like I didn't understand that until like kind of a few years in, just how big the group is. And to give you a sense, so if you sort of include like the hobbyists, but the hobbyists could take it pretty seriously, you're looking at over 100,000 people. And so on one side of the spectrum, you're going to have guys who are sort of going out with metal detectors. And the other side, you're going to have sometimes even sponsored, very sophisticated expedition groups that use very high-end equipment, and anything from like georadar, lidar, magnetometers. I mean, and like very fancy digging equipment. Just like, and then you have a small subset of profiteers, and those are the guys who are sort of digging up World War I and World War II artifacts and selling on the black market. Those guys are sort of too canny. I didn't really meet them. They sort of understood it wasn't in their interest to speak to me. And so that's fine. But for the everyone else, so look, my initial reactions, I didn't understand what to make of it. Especially let's say with the swastikas and the Nazi iconography, it's very off-putting. Then you sort of understand that they have a very different relationship to it, and so they're regarding it as not sort of like they hate the Nazis with a passion, like vehemently hate them, and so but yet I would meet the guys who had sort of private museums. They had like constructed a private museum. One guy even had a second house where he kept all of his treasure, and all that most of that treasure was Nazi paraphernalia. And so you're like, okay, that's not the same thing as like walking to a house in the Midwest and encountering Nazi paraphernalia. It just means something very different. It really is something like plunder or like trophies or scalps, stuff they take to sort of announce their skill and announce their sort of weird sort of kind of dominance over this fallen enemy. And so that definitely, you're like, it's weird, it's off-putting, but it's not the same. And the second thing is my first sense of them as a group was that they were very trivial, like very frivolous. Like I saw them as men with fancy toys, getting drunk in the forest and having fun and having very little respect or even sort of consciousness about the history. But as I met more of them, that perspective got challenged more and more. And so, on one level, I would meet guys with Jewish grandparents. They didn't necessarily identify as Jews, but they definitely saw their grandparents' legacy as part of their identity and saw their work as a response to that and a sense of responsibility. Or, I would, and some of the scholarship of them sometimes actually gets pretty serious. And so like as a collective, they're definitely net contributing. So there's one guy, I always mention him, named Krzysztof. He lived in a small town, Świdnica. He's just like a really nice guy. And he had spent years researching and locating a lost concentration camp. And so like no one else was going to do that. And so like he spent years interviewing locals, digging up documents, and he took me out into the field and he showed me in the field like a line of cemented in bricks, which had been the foundation of the barracks. And that concentration camp was not on the map before. It was a lost camp. It would have been lost. And then the last thing I'll say is that, and this took me a couple of years to sort of appreciate, was that they also have a sense of guardianship.
Mm.
As in a lot of these sites, like as you move away from, call it like the major sites of Holocaust memory, like Auschwitz and Warsaw and the big cities and the ghettos, there, the level of institutional attention falls off very fast. And so these sites are pretty off the map, and so to speak, and no one's taking care of them. Like no one's doing no one I know is doing their doctorate on Project Reset. And like there's a museum, but it's spread very thin, it's very understaffed, and it's sort of like it's a museum for the whole Gross Rosen network. And so these guys are the ones cleaning it. So there's a chapter in the book where like they're drinking all night and they're having a really good time. But then the next morning, this section got cut. But the next morning they woke up before dawn and spent 14 hours cleaning.
Wow.
And so you're like, okay, they're having a complicated relationship with it. And so my takeaway was like, I think their motivations could be not great sometimes, or maybe not the purest motivations, but that doesn't detract from the contribution. And so like the way I say it in the book is like a motivated love can still be love. And so
And
yeah,
it sounds like they're preservationists in some ways. I mean, preserving.
for sure, for some, look, I think a lot of them are rooting the sites too. They're archaeologically speaking very irresponsible. And
Yeah.
so it's very hard to sort of pass a clean verdict on them.
It's interesting. I want to switch a little bit to, more of a sort of genre question. At the end of your book, you talk about how this book could have been a novel. And I think it's Dwight Garner in the New York Times who kind of compares it tonally to Jonathan Safran Foer's Everything is Illuminated. And you even at the end offer what would be your fictional ending had you chosen to end it as a novel. And I think it's an amazing fictional ending. I have to say, I thought it was really touching. But why did you decide not to write this as a novel?
I like praise for the book I didn't write. That's my favorite.
You did. You wrote the ending.
It's funny. There was a version, I wrote a draft in which I wrote an entire chapter of the book that I didn't write. And I was like,
That's a fascinating idea. Oh, I love
that's
that.
an interesting idea. So the question was, why didn't I write it as a novel?
Yeah, why didn't you?
I
mean, did you think something would be lost, I guess? Because, I mean, you can so clearly see this as a novel. I think anyone can. And I mean, you can definitely see it as a movie. You can see the fictionalized version.
Yeah, it was like, it was more, I never wanted to write it as a novel, but there were sort of the moments, especially when the stories refused to behave, when you're like, ugh, it's so out of my control. I'm so much at the mercy of all these actors and characters and courts and travel and all these things that you feel very frustrated, feel very lost. Like here's a little bit of another like insider, a little publishing insight. It's just like when I sold the book, nothing had been done. And so, the publishers read it, a few publishers were interested. They read the proposal and they all came back to me with the same question. They're like, cool story. We really like it. You're going to get the building back, right? Like that. And I was like, for sure. Of course I'm going to get the bill. I was going to be in October. It's going to be in like 5 months. Like, that's what I thought. And then it didn't happen. And I was panicking. Like I had to sort of,
I actually remember you telling me this.
yeah, I was really in panic. I had to like come clean to the editor. I had to have like this sort of awkward conversation where I was like, listen, remember I told you that I knew how the book was going to end? And so what the novel sort of, it just lets you off the hook. Like you could sort of imagine all these things. But at the end of the day, I am very grateful for it because the novel has to make sense. Like the lessons sort of have to be clear. The narrative has to be like relatively linear. You could get experimental, but it has to fit. And I was like, you know what? The story didn't fit. The story didn't fit into like the template. It was like I took a familiar story and I followed it through until the unfamiliarity revealed itself. And so like, yeah, I don't have a clean ending. Like I would never be able to have not a clean ending in a novel. It doesn't work. And so it's like the fact that nonfiction, when you sort of break it, it actually, it all has to be true, but also it can, that's also a sort of permission. It's not just a restriction. And I was like, if you could sort of spend enough time to locate like the meaning of that truth, regardless of like how much of an arc it presented, then I was like, to me, that was really valuable. And what allowed me to do, it sort of knocked me off course. And so like, I think when I started out, I hadn't really interrogated what I was doing. And I saw this building as the end game. I was like, okay, I'm gonna get the building back, and then the story's over because I win. Like that's the pride. Like it's the game. I'm trying to get this. That's the arc. I either get it or I fail spectacularly, and that's also a story. And so the fact that that didn't happen, and I still had to write this book and sort of find the meaning of it, it really it forced me to interrogate what I was doing, and like what revealed itself. And it's going to sound like obvious now, but it wasn't at the time. Is that the building, like honestly, who cares? Like the building is a symbol, and so it sort of represents my own searching and my own struggle to make meaning, and also a sort of reaching towards my grandfather in ways that, had it been a novel, I don't know what sort of novel would allow myself to sort of mind those questions.
It's interesting. I mean, I think the way you end it actually, it brings out that theme very well, because there's someone else on his own quest, and the building is incidental, and the golden eggs are incidental in so many ways, because it is about.
They are incidental. It's funny how people aren't. Some people are.
I have to say, I wasn't convinced that that ending was true at all. I thought it might be fictional, but I've now heard you talk, and it seems to be true. So we could save that for another time. But so this is one way you put your project of, thinking it's about the building and then discovering it's not. There's another scene early on, maybe in the first chapter, where you're at the cemetery with your father. You're at the grave of your grandfather, whom you didn't know. I think you're saying Tehillim or Psalms by rote. And you say something like you felt the shape of sadness, but not actual sadness. And I thought that was tremendously evocative language. But I'm wondering if that's another way to sort of frame the project, and if you would say that by writing this, you filled in the shape of sadness, or if, no, that's not true either. I mean, I think the shape of sadness was somehow because you knew so little. So all you could do was kind of see the structures of it, but
Yeah.
there were no particulars to it. Do you feel like any of that has been filled in?
Sort of. The way I've sort of come to understand it is that I went from a comfortable ignorance to an uneasy ignorance.
Hmm.
And sort of like I might not have sort of acquired that much hard information about my grandfather, or like and I will say, I mean, as an aside, like post publication of the book, it sort of revived a conversation in my family about his legacy, which to me has been really interesting and very powerful. But yeah, I started from a place of like a very like ignorance about my ignorance. It was just like it was totally unexamined. Like I didn't know his war story, but also I didn't feel like I was disturbed by by his war story that I didn't know, or by the fact that I didn't know it. And so what this has forced me to do, and kind of ironically, because the story I did access wasn't his, it was Abraham's, his cousin, but it did sort of allow me to sort of articulate my own ignorance and to sort of like see that as part of my legacy, an uneasy ignorance. And so, yeah, it sort of reframed the searching as in like it is a confrontation rather than an answer. Like I'm not getting answers, and I'm comfortable with that. But the point is to like push those questions. All right. I don't know. The metaphors get all slippery really fast when you're in this space, but like, yeah. But I do. That's an interesting read, like the shape of sadness. I hadn't thought of that.
Well, let me ask you a related question, because you do learn a lot about Abraham. You don't learn a lot about your father, and you, in the course of the book, kind of express some doubt about, how important that is, or some guilt about the fact that you're pursuing Abraham's story, and that you're learning so much more about Abraham than you are about your grandfather. But aside from just, you do obviously, you share some DNA with Abraham, but aside from that, you're both writers, and so you share a lot with this man. And I'm wondering if that occurred to you, if that was meaningful to you, that you were somehow traveling on these like parallel paths, or.
Sort of. I like it's funny because it's the Holocaust memoir. So Abraham wrote this Holocaust memoir, which is sort of, I don't believe he wrote before or after, as far as I know. And so this diary, the secret diary that he kept while working on the camps that survived him, and like that's the text that has become a sacred text among the treasure hunters, and had also been published in Israel, though there it's mostly forgotten. Um, yeah, it's weird. I think I wouldn't say I sort of related to him as a writer, but I will say it sort of gave me something. That part of his legacy was really rich to me, sort of exploring this legacy of a text surviving the author and also having a split legacy. So it had a legacy in Israel and it had a legacy in Poland, and they're not the same. And it sort of left it up to me to sort of square that and sort of like triangulate and like understand who's the person. And so like I'm most comfortable that's my comfort zone of like trying to sort of read a text and understand it as opposed to a person who I'm not going to meet. I'm only going to meet him refractively. I'm only going to meet him through people who remembered him, and he died a long time ago and he was a very quirky guy. So the quirks tend to overwhelm like the memory. Like everyone's like, yeah, he raised pigeons. I'm like, that's like a colorful anecdote, but like I'm not getting closer to a sense of him. But the text was like a rich space for me because it's yeah, that's something I could grasp. I feel comfortable in that space.
So, you know, this is obviously a third generation Holocaust narrative, and you're very aware. I mean, we've said this throughout, but you're so aware of the kind of genre you're writing in, and of course, you lament the fact that there is such a genre as Holocaust narratives, but we all know that there is. How would you describe your relationship to kind of first and second generation Holocaust narratives, or what do you think you were doing that was like them or unlike them? Um, you know,
I
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any comparison with I mean, with firsthand.
right.
They're going to be they're basically not. They're something like super literary. I mean, they're sort of like they exist. They can't really you can't really approach them with like the regular set of aesthetic or critical considerations. Second
Yeah,
generation, I I honestly don't read that much of that. I have a hard time relating because they feel sort of they tend to be motivated by trauma, and
mm,
I've felt I'm like, and that's I respect it, but I have felt I didn't understand like it doesn't I don't relate to it. And like people will be like, my mother experienced this pain and I'm trying to get at the root of this pain and trauma. And I like but I didn't like the trauma that was passed down in family didn't ever really feel that accessible to me. Like my grandfather had died before I was born. And my grandmother was mostly quiet about it until much later when she spoke about it. She spoke about it to my sisters on a video, which was like very surprising to everyone. But it wasn't like a pain that I felt like I had confronted as a kid. And so I didn't feel like it motivated my journey. But I do, maybe a distinction is sort of um, the further we get from the event and sort of as the generations, as you sort of go down generations, I don't know if you could talk about the event without talking about the memory of the event. And so like to me, like I don't know how to do that. I mean, maybe other writers can, and all the power to them. But to me, the thing that has to be wrestled with is going to be the passing down of it and sort of like that mode, how it gets changed. And because I'm not going to pretend to sort of have any kind of moral authority here. And I'm not even that comfortable like talking about my moral authority vis-a-vis someone whose grandparents aren't survivors. Like that's to me, I don't know what that is. I think that it's obviously a very, very important legacy, but I don't know what does that mean for me as a writer? I don't know. But I was like, the thing that I feel like has to be grappled with is like sort of the modes that it gets talked about and sort of like what is the storytelling mechanism? Like what are the containers for the memory? How does it sort of intersect with like my personal family? I just think it has to be honest, and you can't really ape the generation above you because it doesn't work. It just it will feel hollow.
yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. I want to maybe ask you two more questions, and then maybe we'll open it up if there are some questions from the audience. Um, you know, you're a first time published author. This is your first book. And you received a lot of acclaim. I think the New York Times must have written about you, I don't know, half a dozen times. It was crazy. You were in the New Yorker. People magazine, for God's sakes, picked you up. That was really shocking. Um, and I'm wondering, you know, what the success means, or if this changes things for you, does this mean something for your next project? Do you have a next project? What is your life now that you're a critically acclaimed published author look like?
Not that different. More Zoom calls than usual. Look, it changes the calculus for the next project. And so I think, for the challenge of getting your first book published is very different than the challenge of getting your second book published, which isn't to say it's not a challenge. It's just the most important metric for your second book is how the first book did. And so that feels like a weight off my chest, to be honest. Like, I feel very lucky that I think if I came up with a nonfiction project, I think it would be an easier sell than it would have been otherwise. I don't know how that's going to translate to fiction projects. It's an open question. And but like, I also think it's a sort of, I found myself in a position, like in a weird way that I wasn't expecting or had anticipated. I'm being called upon to represent a certain sort of writer, at least this year, or like a certain sort of like to talk about, like most interviews are asking me, like, how do you feel as like a grandson who's like writing and this sort of memory and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's, I haven't really grappled with that. Like, what is that responsibility? Am I a sort of spokesperson in a way, because the book got a certain kind of attention and it sort of became, this year at least, sort of like the 3G Holocaust book. I don't know. It's not something I thought about while writing it. And so that who knows moving forward? It's not a position I'm all that comfortable with either, to be honest, because I don't know if I'm that representative.
So you need to quickly publish another book about something radically different.
Radically different, like Canadian cuisine or something.
Yeah.
Like poutine, like a poutine cookbook.
That's really great. Okay, the last thing I want to say is that for many of you who don't know, that Menachem has become a Twitter sensation in the last few weeks. He had posted.
Twitter sensation.
What was that?
Someone became a Twitter sensation.
Okay, well, before this, Menachem tweeted, and as far as I can tell, received little to no recognition for his tweets. But then a few weeks ago, something changed, and I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see the tweet that made you famous, or someone famous. Menachem, can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this tweet and what it's like to be Twitter famous?
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, Mayan's mother-in-law the story starts with Mayan's mother-in-law, who very kindly invited me to speak at her synagogue in Riverdale. And, it got a nice group, and my mother came onto the Zoom, and this is a screenshot. My mother is Judy, and she wrote what you read. I don't have to read it out loud. And I thought it was funny, so I took a screenshot and I posted it on Twitter, and then I became Twitter famous. I won the internet for a day.
You did. It was a little more than a day, I think.
Yeah, and so it was a lot of fun, and they got picked up by British tabloids and really ran there. Didn't get picked up by American tabloids, thank God.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and like BuzzFeed. The thing is, I don't really know how all this stuff works, so you might even know better than me how like social media goes, but it did catch on fire. And so yeah, that's my mom.
And have you gotten any dates from this?
It's a good question. I think did I get it? I definitely got a lot of messages from people. I don't know if I got dates, but I think someone recently asked me out on a date, and I was like, oh, how does she know I'm single? And then I was like, oh, right. Yeah. This is how she knows I'm single.
Everyone knows you're single. We're going to need Judy to keep doing this, though, so that, your status can be updated in real time, so that if you're in a relationship, people will know to back off. When you're single, people will know to pounce. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Zach, do we have questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have some really great questions that our audience members are asking. We have viewers, whether you're viewing on Facebook or on our webpage, make sure to drop a question from Menachem in the chat. We're monitoring both of those pages, so we will be asking it live. Jerry has a really great note and question. He says, I loved your book. Thanks for sharing your family's story. There's a poignant episode where your father challenges you about whether your grandfather would want you to continue your journey. How has his view changed now that the book is published?
How is my father's view, right?
Correct.
It goes back to what I mentioned before briefly. I think what this book has done within my family is sort of reignited a conversation about my grandfather's legacy. And so my father's been, both my parents have been like exceptionally proud of the book's success, and it's sort of helped. It's really my father actually wrote this really beautiful sort of response. There was let me start again. Like one of the questions I had gotten in an early interview was like, what would you have said to your grandfather if he was alive? And I found that to be a kind of an impossible question to answer. And then my father, he sort of wrote a response to that question. And he sort of like, let me tell you more about my grandfather. He wrote it to his children and to his nephews and nieces and to sort of everyone in the family. And just to reestablish and re-explain like the importance of legacy and the importance of tradition in the eyes of my grandfather. And so it's not the building, that the building is the building. Like it will happen or it will not happen. And it's an adventure and it's like fun, but the book has taken on a life of its own. And like, I think what I'm most grateful for is that it's sort of reopening channels or opening, in like how to talk about like those who came before me and sort of how to like reconnect with my grandfather and sort of like what he stood for.
Danielle asks, she says, you outline the nuances of Nazi imagery so well, in that not everyone who possesses it does so because they are Nazi sympathizers or neo-Nazis. In this era of cancel culture, what do you think this can teach us about our wider society and culture?
Wow. In our, I don't know. Mayan, help me. What do you?
Well, I do think it speaks to, I think it speaks to the brilliance of this book and the subtlety of this book and maybe the really word is the nuance, that you are very, very nuanced in how you approach everyone. And so no one is brushed aside, no one is canceled, no one is you're this and that means X, Y, or Z. And so you do handle the treasure hunters, you handle Poland itself with such delicacy, maybe in a way that would be uncomfortable for some survivors or some families of survivors.
Now I'm understanding the question a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's I don't know if that's the question, but that was my understanding, that you handle complexity so well.
Right. So it's funny. That was never, I like to me, what's the alternative? I'd be like, oh my God, swastikas. Okay, that's actually sounds like a normal reaction. Like swastikas, I'm out, done. But like, yeah, like we have to be context aware, but I think you can be critical. Like I don't want to withhold criticism from things that deserve it, but I also, to sort of not interrogate where it is and what it means seems like a lost opportunity at the very least.
Good question. Are there others, Zach?
We have a couple more, and I think we have time for them.
Okay,
Caroline asks, have you read East West Street? If so, did you feel a kinship with that story as you wrote your own?
It depends who the author is. I don't think so.
East West Street?
I don't know.
Google.
Okay, no problem. Let's move on to the next one.
I'll take let me take an opportunity that if people have questions or anecdotes or like more general questions, research related or genealogy, feel free to reach out to me directly. I think Zach could put my email address in the chat there. It's just plunder.booktalk@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from anyone.
Menachem, it seems like we should definitely have read East West Street. So
who's the author?
Philippe Sands.
Oh, yes. I've been hearing about this book a lot now. Okay. I have not read it. This is a book I weirdly had not heard about it until like until after my book was published. And so it's on the list.
We can form a book club.
Yeah, and Caroline could join, and we could.
That's a great idea.
And I think a good question to close this out with is, we have another question that says, what's next? What's your next book about? Are you even thinking about that yet?
Yeah, so I wrote a novel in grad school about Yiddish poets in interwar New York City, including one who's like sort of a terrorist. And so it's it's funny when when I was seeking representation, I submitted both projects. One about Yiddish poets in interwar New York City, a novel that had actual Yiddish in it, and a book proposal about a nonfiction book with Nazi gold. And the agent liked both of them very much, but she was like, I think one of them is going to be easier to sell than the other. You generally, a book, rule of thumb in publishing, if your book has Nazi gold in it, it's probably an easier sell than Yiddish poetry. And so, I would love to go back to that novel. I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, but it would be a real pleasure. Well, no, it would actually be miserable, but it would be like a nice opportunity to sort of revisit it and get it back into shape.
Great. Okay, so I think, Zach, is that it for comments?
Yep, that's all that's coming through the pipeline right now.
Okay, thank you everyone so much, and join us. I think it's May 24th when we talk to Daniel Liebskind. Look out for email, and have a great day.
We are no